Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take all those dense sources you send us, stacks of research really, and try to pull out the core ideas.
Yeah, distill the key insights.
Exactly. And today, we're looking through a very specific, very powerful lens. It's the analysis of global conflict, of war, but entirely through the framework of Marxism and imperialism.
It's definitely heavy on theory, digging deep into history, economics. But our goal here is pretty straightforward.
Which is?
To synthesize the main argument that runs through all these texts. Basically the idea that there's this fundamental, maybe unavoidable link between global capitalism, fierce corporate competition, and, well, armed conflict.
So what really jumped out at me from the reading was the core theoretical bit they lean on. They're using a concept from, nearly 2 centuries ago? An old German military thinker.
Clausewitz.
Right, Clausewitz. And using him to explain 21st century geopolitics, it feels like quite a leap.
It's definitely a bold connection they're making.
So let's jump right in there. Segment 1, war as an extension of economic policy. How does that work?
Okay, yeah, that's the perfect place to start. The main anchor, theoretically speaking, for these sources is Karl von Clausewitz.
The famous quote.
The famous quote, "War is a mere continuation of policy by other means." So from this view, war isn't some breakdown of the system. It's a tool, part of the political toolkit.
Okay, but the sources we looked at, they don't just stop there, do they? They're not just saying war is political. They take Clausewitz and seem to add this huge economic layer.
That's the critical step. They argue, yes, war is an extension of the struggle between nations and also between classes within nations.
Right.
But here's the twist, the Marxist extension. They argue that the struggle between nations is itself just an extension, maybe the most violent form, of the competition that's always happening between huge multinational corporations.
So a competition for
Right.
markets, resources.
Yep, exactly. Markets, resources, cheap labor, spheres of influence globally. The nation state, in this view, acts largely to advance those corporate interests.
Wow, okay. That completely reframes things then. It means, according to these sources, war isn't a policy failure. It's almost like a necessary function.
That's pretty much it, a function of the economic system itself. It's like saying that intense, sometimes violent competition isn't just some unfortunate side effect of capitalism.
This is the engine.
It's the engine, and it inevitably, they argue, leads to military conflict when other means fail or aren't sufficient.
So the research basically says capitalism is inherently, what was the phrase, riddled with war.
Riddled with war, yes, because of this constant, never-ending struggle over the profits they've extracted from labor.
How does that leap happen, from profit struggle to actual war?
Well, the argument goes like this. Individual companies, or even whole national economies driven by corporate interests, maximize profits. They expand. Eventually, they need new markets, or cheaper resources, or more control over trade routes.
And persuasion only goes so far.
Right, so the state, their state, steps in to secure those economic ends. And often, that means stepping in violently, using military force or the threat of it.
That's a very deterministic argument, but I had to push back a little, or ask how they handle complexity. Doesn't this risk simplifying things too much?
How so?
Well, if all conflict is just boiled down to corporate competition, what about conflicts that seem genuinely rooted in ethnic hatred, or religious fanaticism, or leaders acting out of pure ideology, not economics?
That's a fair challenge, and it's one the sources anticipate. They don't deny that ethnic tensions exist, or religious ones.
Right.
But they argue those tensions are almost always leveraged. They're fueled, manipulated, militarized by the underlying economic competition between bigger powers.
So existing divisions get exploited.
Exactly. Imperialist powers, in this view, will always use internal divisions, ethnic, religious, political, whatever works, to gain strategic advantage, secure resources, or undermine rivals. The economic motive, they insist, is still primary, even if it's hidden.
Okay. And this framework leads straight to the fundamental attitude we saw in the reading. If the system itself is the root cause, well, what's the solution they propose? Just opposing specific wars isn't enough.
Well, opposing specific imperialist wars is seen as absolutely essential, a duty. But fundamentally, no, it's not enough in the long run. Because they believe the only way to permanently get rid of war and the misery it causes is to, and this is their phrase, rid humanity of the capitalist system itself.
Yeah.
They see reforms as maybe temporary band-aids, structural change is what's needed.
And there was that historical reference they used to back this up, the Second International's Stuttgart Resolution. Can you remind us what that was about?
Sure. Stuttgart, 1907. It was a pretty radical agreement among socialist parties before World War I.
What did it say?
It basically said that if a major imperialist war did break out, which they saw coming, the working classes across Europe should not rally behind their governments. Instead, they should use the chaos, the crisis, the collapse that war would bring to push for socialist revolution, to overthrow the system that caused the war.
So turn an imperialist crisis into an opportunity for fundamental change.
Precisely. And that basic methodology, using the system's crises against itself, is still the core attitude reflected in the source material today.
Okay, so that's the theory. War as corporate competition intensified. Where did the sources say we see this playing out now? Let's move to segment 2, imperialism, today.
Right. So we need to look at the current global setup. The sources often use the term Pax Americana.
The American peace?
Yeah, though they quickly add it's a euphemistically referred to term. It really just describes the period of, well, pretty complete U.S. imperial dominance since the Soviet Union collapsed.
And this dominance, according to the analysis, has had one major effect on global conflict patterns.
Yes, it's largely excluded open warfare between the major imperialist powers themselves. The U.S., Western Europe, Japan, they compete economically fiercely, but they haven't gone to war with each other under this U.S. umbrella.
So no repeat of 1914 among the top dogs, at least not yet.
Not yet. And this is the huge caveat the sources always stress. This Pax Americana is fragile, and it absolutely does not exclude what they call small wars.
Wars on the periphery.
Wars on the periphery, proxy wars, interventions. They point out that recent decades have seen millions killed and displaced in conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia.
So the argument is, as long as the underlying corporate competition exists,
armed conflict will remain. It's endemic to the system, even if the form changes. The pressure builds and erupts somewhere.
This naturally leads to the big question the sources grapple with today. Where do Russia and China fit into this picture? Are they playing the same game?
A huge focus, yeah. The sources spend a lot of time analyzing their character.
And the conclusion is?
Broadly, yes. They operate within the same fundamental logic. Their economic models might differ internally. State control is different. But their global actions, massive capital export, seeking resources, building spheres of influence.
Like Belt and Road.
Like Belt and Road, or Russia's energy politics and military reach. The analysis frames them as challenger imperialist powers. They're competing with the established U.S. hegemony.
So something like the Russian invasion of Ukraine isn't seen as just, say, one leader's decision or an isolated historical event.
No. It's analyzed as part of that larger ongoing struggle. A violent clash over geopolitical positioning, resources, market access, security interests, essentially. A conflict between competing capitalist state interests, however differently organized they might be.
And this lens is also applied to other hotspots, like Iran.
Definitely. The long-running tension between the U.S. and the Iranian regime is viewed through that same prism. It's about regional dominance, control over energy routes, undermining rivals. The specific political rhetoric is important, but the underlying driver is seen as that imperialist competition.
Okay, let's pivot slightly and look at some case studies. The sources use specific historical examples and ongoing situations to kind of ground this theory. Vietnam comes up significantly.
It does, particularly the Tet Offensive.
Which the sources call the definitive turning point. Why Tet?
Well, Tet launched January 30th, 31st, 1968. It was just audacious. You had around 70,000 North Vietnamese soldiers and NLF fighters launching coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, hitting cities, even the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon.
Militarily, though, wasn't it considered a setback for them? They took heavy losses.
Huge losses, yes. Militarily, it was arguably a defeat for the attackers, but politically and psychologically, back in the U.S.,
that was different.
Completely different. It shattered the illusion. U.S. generals and politicians have been telling the public for years, we're winning, there's light at the end of the tunnel.
And Tet showed that wasn't true.
It showed the war was nowhere near over. The sheer scale of the offensive proved the enemy was still strong, determined, capable. That's why the sources call it the real turning point. It broke the political will back home, fueled the anti-war movement, and ultimately led to the U.S. withdrawal.
So a military loss becomes a strategic political victory.
In this analysis, yes. It exposed the reality of the imperialist venture.
And we see the same kind of analysis applied to the Middle East, which the sources portray as being in this state of perpetual crisis, largely due to external interference.
Yes, the idea of local groups being used by bigger powers is a recurring theme.
Like the Kurds.
The Kurdish struggle is presented as a tragic prime example. Decades of being, as the sources put it, used as pawns by the major imperialist powers in their geopolitical games.
Their desire for autonomy manipulated.
Consistently played off against Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, depending on the strategic needs of the U.S. or Russia or regional powers at that moment, their own goals often become secondary.
And thinking about Syria more broadly, the civil war, the sources were quite critical of the Western response, particularly around things like chemical attacks.
They were. The argument presented is that the loud condemnations, the bellicose rhetoric about atrocities from Western leaders,
Serves another purpose.
often serves as a useful distraction, in their words. A way for leaders facing problems at home, economic issues, declining popularity to shift focus, look tough on the world stage, and rally support around an external enemy or crisis.
While perhaps avoiding deeper engagement or solutions.
Or while pursuing other strategic aims quietly.
There was also that really stark contrast the sources drew back in May 2018.
Ah, yes. That was powerful. They highlighted the split screen. On one side, you had U.S. officials and Israeli leaders celebrating 70 years of Israel's founding, opening the new U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, a hugely controversial move.
And on the other side, the same day.
The same day, May 14th, massive protests were happening in Gaza, part of the Great March of Return movement. And the response: Israeli snipers killed 59 Palestinian demonstrators and injured over 2,700 more.
So the sources juxtapose the diplomatic celebration directly against that bloodshed.
To make the point that they're not separate events, they're intrinsically linked aspects of the same ongoing conflict, rooted in occupation, displacement, and the assertion of power, backed by imperial interests. The celebration couldn't be detached from the violence it implicitly endorsed or ignored.
And this method, looking beyond the immediate event to the structural causes, they apply that historically too, right? Back to World War I.
Exactly. When analyzing the start of WWI, the Great Slaughter, as they call it, the sources, insists you can't just focus on the assassination in Sarajevo, the individuals involved.
You have to look deeper.
You have to look at the deeper causes, which for them means the intense, unbearable pressures of imperialism. The competing empires in Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, locked in this desperate struggle for colonies, markets, resources, global dominance. Sarajevo was just the spark that lit a massive powder keg built by decades of imperialist competition.
Okay, so bring this all together. What's the main takeaway from this entire body of analysis?
I think the core thesis, repeated consistently, is that war isn't some abstract thing. It's not just a failure of diplomacy. It's not random. It's presented as a concrete, almost logical result of the global political economy as it currently exists.
The inevitable eruption of capitalist competition, basically.
That's how they frame it, yes.
And that structural view, it leads to a very specific way of thinking about how we should oppose war. This is maybe the key point for you, the listener.
Right. The sources argue pretty forcefully that just declaring you're against violence in general is, well, almost meaningless.
Utopian was the word used.
Meaningless and utopian, like saying you oppose politics in general. It doesn't engage with the reality of power.
So the opposition needs to be more specific.
It needs to be concrete.
Yeah.
The crucial question they force you to ask is, what kind of violence are we struggling against?
What's the distinction they make?
It's the distinction between the violence of the oppressor, the violence used to maintain an exploitative system, to enforce imperial control, and the violence of the oppressed, the violence used in resistance, in trying to overthrow that system. That distinction, for these authors, is fundamental.
Which brings us to the final thought, the challenge left hanging by this research. If we accept the premise, even just for argument's sake,
if violence is a tool of policy,
and policies driven by this relentless corporate imperialist competition,
then what does it really take to stop war?
Right. What kind of structural change going way beyond just calling for peace or a temporary ceasefire would actually be necessary to dismantle the mechanisms that keep generating conflict in the first place? That's the big question this analysis leaves for you to think about.